Day today. So thankful to be here on the Sabbath. And then welcome to all those that are on the webcast as well. We're glad that you're joining us. Now, it's no secret that besides individuals of the Bible, the historical figure that I find most fascinating is our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Now, in 2019, my family had an opportunity to tour his home and presidential museum in Springfield, Illinois. I highly suggest doing both. It was very enlightening. But what you come away with is a realization that Lincoln lived in far different times, but he was very much a man of the people and could relate to anyone and everyone. He had a strong moral compass, and he wore his emotions on his sleeve. Now, during Lincoln's era, the United in USA was very much on the brink of collapse. Slavery was a major point of contention, and it seemed that every American had an opinion on how to handle the new states formed out of Western expansion. Now, Stephen Douglas, a prominent senator of the day, authored legislation aiding the pro-slavery cause. And in turn, radical abolitionists such as John Brown rose up using retaliatory violence. Now, the final stroke of contention occurred when Lincoln won the 1860 election on only 40% of the popular vote. For the first time in history, the pro-slavery southern states had been beaten by the Electoral College, and a vocal opponent of slavery was headed to the White House. Before Lincoln was even sworn in, 7 states decided to secede from the Union. Now, if one were to step back to view this part of American history, it would be easy to note that the U.S. was fueled by unbridled reaction. Many were willing to risk entire livelihoods to champion their cause, whether pro or anti-slavery. Now, a patient Lincoln did not see the dissolution of the United States into 2 separate countries as a long-term viable option. Now, as I said earlier, he had strong convictions, but he was not a man of haste. And he studied his Bible, so perhaps he was familiar with Proverbs 14:29, which says, "He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly." Again, that's in Proverbs 14:29. Today I want to speak on having the wrongful habit of immediate reaction. Now, it's an epidemic, especially of this present age. Now, our father and elder brother are described as long-suffering, patient, and merciful. These are the attributes that we're to emulate. The title of my message is Respond and Don't Just React. Again, that's respond and don't just react. Now, one of my most cherished books is a collection of Lincoln's letters and speeches. In it, one can read his various thoughts on slavery, religion, and his own mental state. Now, Lincoln became a well-versed orator, but he always came back to the most powerful tool in his communication arsenal, and that was the handwritten letter. Privy to just a few in his inner circle, Lincoln sometimes wrote what he called hot letters. These were first draft letters penned when he was infuriated with someone and was in need of a cathartic way to translate his innermost frustrations onto paper. Lincoln set aside his hot letters until his emotions cooled off. Once calm, he would either edit them drastically or he just would not send them at all. Please turn with me to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. Much of the New Testament, including this book, consists of letters. So, I wonder how many of these started off as hot letters. That's just food for thought. James. What James wrote was that he was writing to the scattered 12 tribes of Israel. Again, this is James chapter 5, and we will be starting in verse 7. "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." Dropping down to verse 10, "My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful." Now, James reminds us in this passage that Job went through trials and pain, but he took time to establish his heart. We know that he sat in sackcloth and ashes for days. Now, some in Job's position might immediately lash out and blame God. A rash person would even turn to violence or suicide. And we can learn from both Lincoln and Job's examples that time is usually on our side. Most decisions, even when evoking strong emotions, don't require immediate action. In fact, level-headed thinking only comes after we've calmed and mulled over all options. A reaction differs from a response because it's done without reserving time to think. Respond, don't just react. Now, a second way to stave off reacting when you should be responding is by seeking wise counsel. Again, a responsive person relies on the help of others instead of just reacting by themselves. Please turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. Here we'll be reading about King Rehoboam. Under his father Solomon, the tribes of Israel had prospered more than any other time in the nation's history. Thus, the newly crowned Rehoboam wanted to set a tone for his upcoming rule. 1 Kings chapter 12, and I'll start in verse 6. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, and he said, "How do you advise me to answer these people?" And they spoke to him, saying, "If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And we know that didn't turn out so well. Rehoboam first consulted with the elders who had successfully worked under his father, but then went with his peers who may have only lived off the fruits of the older generation before them. His friends likely lacked the wisdom, experience, even the character of the elders. To Rehoboam's credit, he sought counsel, as should we. In her book, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin explains how Lincoln put together a presidential cabinet not always in agreement, but capable of giving him the most helpful advice for our nation. 3 of the men he chose had run against him for the Republican nomination. Lincoln's remark on this was, quote, "We need the strongest men of the party in the cabinet. We needed to hold our own people together. I'd looked the party over and concluded that these were the very strongest men. Then I had no right to deprive the country of their service." End quote. So let me rephrase my second point. To respond, a godly person relies on the help of others who know what they're doing instead of just reacting on their own. Now turn with me to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians 5. This is an epistle of Paul. And here we will see the final point that I have on making sure we respond, not just reacting. Ephesians chapter 5, and we'll be starting in verse 8. Ephesians 5:8. "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord." Dropping down to verse 15. "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is." So this same concept of taking time in our decisions is spoken of, but as God's heirs, we must go a step further and make sure we are aligning with our Father's will. Praying is a prerequisite. Fasting, meditation, Bible study can also be applied to this task. Now, when we have to make snap decisions or we are without wise counsel, praying is sometimes the only option, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, seeking God's will is a requirement for a godly response. Now, take away time, take away advice from others, and take away God's will. What you're left with are just reactions. And quite frankly, those don't always turn out so well. Brethren, I implore you to take the time needed for level-headed thinking, obtain wise counsel, and always seek out God's will. Respond and don't just react.